All right, please grab your cup of coffee and grab a seat. We're going to get started here. Sorry to be right in front of you all. I'll be out of your way in just a second.
Right, go for it.
I'm Chris Wilson. I'm the Deputy Director of our Mexico Institute here at the Wilson Center. I want to welcome you all here today to what is, for us, a very exciting time to launch this report that has been put together under the leadership of Ambassador Tony Wayne on North America 2.0 Workforce Development Agenda. I'd like to thank Ambassador Wayne for his leadership on this project. And with the USMCA, I don't know how many of you have seen the news, read the stories this morning, but it appears that the USMCA, the updated version of NAFTA, will be signed in Mexico City this afternoon, or at least that some sort of agreement on the details of concluding the final rounds of negotiations will be announced today. In many ways, that makes this a perfect day to launch this report. In one way, it makes this not a very good day because we had actually planned on having Ambassador Bárcena of the Mexican Embassy here with us today, but she jumped on a flight very, very early this morning to get back to Mexico to be there for the festivities, if they are that, in fact. It is actually quite fitting, though, that we're holding this event here today. We began doing this work on workforce development after doing work on NAFTA and the impact of U.S.-Mexico trade on the U.S. labor market, on jobs in the United States. And what we found very clearly in that work was that the decline of manufacturing jobs in the United States was not, in fact, linked to trade between the United States and Mexico, but was much more the result of automation and other technological change in the United States, changing the nature of work for people in this country, for workers here. It had a little bit to do with trade also, we did find that, but much more to do with trade with China, the big spike in trade there, and a very disbalanced nature of that trade than it did with Mexico. But we needed to have a NAFTA renegotiation given sort of the politics around it, and it really also, that NAFTA renegotiation took all the air out of the room. And so while we were trying to say, the real solution lies in a very strong workforce development agenda, that's the way you really deal with the challenges that workers are facing, both in the United States but also in our neighbors' countries, the political conversation was definitely about trade itself and about NAFTA and changing that trade framework. And so one of the things that we hope that this does now that we're reaching a conclusion of that phase is it reopens the door to have a broader conversation between the countries of North America about how it is that we can all be competitive together, how it is that we can have a more inclusive version of regional integration that we build up together. And we at the Wilson Center, very strongly believe that workforce development is the centerpiece of that agenda, or is at least one of the many very important things that need to be a part of that agenda. And so we hope that today represents an opportunity to, share these ideas with all of you, and then hopefully put them on the agenda of the three countries as they continue their conversations together. So with that, let me pass it over to Ambassador Tony Wayne, who will lead today's event.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks, everybody, for being here with us. It is a propitious moment from a lot of different perspectives. A lot of people have written about and thought about how many jobs are going to be redefined over the years ahead, some of which will be eliminated, but new ones can be created. The challenge is, how do we change our systems to let workers learn new skills on an ongoing basis as the workplaces change? Happily, there are initiatives now underway in Mexico, Canada, and the United States to look at these things at a national level. But very interestingly, just yesterday, Axios carried an article saying that the effects of automation are the most misunderstood and underappreciated issue in the 2020 presidential campaign in the United States, and went on to give a clear warning about the potential serious disruptions that you could face, including greater income inequality, less social mobility, greater political unrest, and greater income insecurity unless the United States gets its act together. And that means getting its act together at all sorts of different levels, as we'll talk about today. Very happily, we have representatives of the Government of Canada, Government of the United States with us. As Chris said, we were going to have the representatives of the Government of Mexico. We did get to have an event last week in Mexico City where the Undersecretary of Economy came and talked there about their programs that are going on. And then we have a number of real experts who are going to talk to us about different aspects and talk with us about different aspects of this challenge as we go forward this morning and talk it through. And so we hope we can have then some back and forth also with everybody. Basically, the new Wilson Center report, the simple version of it is that as each other's major economic partners, the three nations of North America should be exploring these challenges, learning from each other, helping each other as we go forward through the creation of multi-stakeholder dialogues. This is a way that you can help avoid the potential disruptions that everybody sees that's out there. But let me start off with, let's see if I can get this to work. So just a few quick facts. We'll go through these quickly. It's already pretty clear that employers aren't finding the people they need with the skills they need. And this is from 2018. And a lot of people suggest this is just going to get worse as we go forward. This is one study that talks about the number of people, and this is from the McKinsey Global Institute, that could have to change occupations by 2030. It looks at Mexico and the United States, didn't have data on Canada, but I assume Canada will be somewhere around in relative size to its economy, somewhere in the similar area. Deloitte looked at this and said, look, if we don't get our skills right in the United States, we could lose up to $2.5 trillion in economic output just in the manufacturing sector in the U.S. over the next decade. Companies are beginning to understand this. This is a World Economic Forum survey, and you know they're seeing the changes that are coming up, the changes that are going to take place in job skills, and then also they're already starting to make their decision on where to invest based on talent availability, not on the price of labor. This is North American data from the survey that WEF does. So they're getting that message already. Then, as many of you know, and we've looked at a lot of times, these new workplaces are going to demand a whole new set of skills from more workers at all different levels. And that means either the reskilling or the upskilling or the basic skilling as you come into the workforce is going to have to be different. You're going to have to learn a larger cluster of these skills you're going to have. And we're going to have to find ways to actually measure these skills in some way. And, you know, we'll talk a bit about that. North America is not the most ready for new technology. You can see this is a rating that the Economist Intelligence Unit did a year ago. You can see where Canada, number 5, the United States, number 9, and Mexico, number 23 in the world. So there's a lot still to be done, even if you have particular questions about this particular study. I think it's indicative of where the three countries are. This is the OECD's looking at where what kind of jobs could be eliminated. But basically, they've found that on average across all their member countries, they think about 14% of jobs are going to be eliminated. Many more are going to be reinvented. That means they then, in all their studies, are saying, so governments, you really need to prepare for, 1, that cluster of workers that aren't going to have jobs anymore. What do you do with them? 2, the cluster of workers that are going to have to learn new skills. And 3, of course, all your young people coming into the workforce. Brookings Institution looked at the United States. What's the effect of automation? They concluded that the same heartland of the country that got hit in the first 15 years of the century is going to get hit really hard again unless there's a change of cooperation between governments, private sector, educational institutions, and that look at the needs in particular areas. And basically what this says is, that what they say, and this is supposed to show, is the two coasts, they're going to have problems, but they're going to do pretty well compared to the heartland. And the heartland's really going to suffer. That's probably the same of certain areas in Canada and Mexico that you look at certain sectors. There aren't good studies available that we found on that, but I think it's indicative of the fact that we're going to have to look carefully, not just at a national level, but at a regional level and a local level, and solutions are going to have to come from each of those levels, with a lot of the innovation taking place at the local level. Again, this is sort of the history of how much North American governments have been spending on workforce-related programs. And you can see, compared to the rest of the OECD, we do really well. Canada's right close to halfway, and the United States and Mexico are the two bottom ones. Though I think, actually, I think Turkey is probably the last one. It just doesn't show up on the OECD chart. So, as a lot of people have argued, however, if we can get the policies right, if we can get the mix right, and the collaboration correct, you can come out with win-win situations with the arrival of all this new technology. Ted Alden, who's here, argued in a study that he helped do for the Council on Foreign Relations of the kind of policies that could lead to those win-win outcomes in the United States. This is a look by Accenture at what companies could do in different sectors if they really got this mix of investment in technology and human capital right. And you can see their projections are you could have more profits and more jobs at the same time. But that's a big leap to make sure you get these policies right as you go forward. So what we've argued in this new study, which you have in front of you, is that the three governments at the national, federal levels should be talking together. They should, in a sense, form an umbrella under which there can be a lot of collaboration between the private sector, sub-federal governments, federal governments too, education institutions, other actors like unions, NGOs, private sector educators that aren't quite universities, basically getting together to look at a number of the key different issues. And in order to prepare these issues, we talked to 36 or so different people who've been thinking about this for a while, and we came up with these 4 clusters that you can see up here. Apprenticeships and other forms of work-based learning, all the issues around certifications that show what kind of an education you have, the issues around how available and good and constant are data about jobs and skill needs, how is it collected, how is it distributed, how is it made available, everybody from the high school counselor, to the worker whose factory is being considered for being shifted somewhere else or changing. Can they actually find out what the skill needs are? And then, of course, they have to have access to educational and re-education and training programs. And then finally, sort of a cluster that's sort of a catch-all cluster of what are the best practices in dealing with this new technology as it sweeps through markets and sweeps through companies. There are certain companies that are doing pretty well at working with local institutions, local governments, local educational institutions, and helping reskill their workers and adapting. So why shouldn't we have opportunities to share those practices so others can learn from them? A big focus in all of this has to be on skills development. But one of the neat things, as Chris mentioned, with USMCA going forward, there is a chapter in USMCA on competitiveness, which asks for the 3 governments to form a committee that will meet on a regular basis to talk about how to make the continent more competitive. There are also parts of the labor chapter that call for regular consultations on key labor issues. This can be very useful at a national level for getting the dialogue headed in the right direction. But that is far from enough. As many of you know, you've got to have this dialogue going on between the cluster of actors. That's what makes it so complicated to get workforce development moving in a good direction, in that it takes a lot of different actors to do that. You have to align education, workforce training, economic development systems, and employer needs. And that is a complicated process, and a number of my colleagues who are going to speak today will be able to talk to that. And it's important to recognize that not only will certain communities need different kinds of help, because it won't come naturally to them, either because of where their history, where they're located, but also different businesses are going to have different needs. For SMEs, small and medium-sized businesses, it's a lot more challenging to figure out, how do I reskill people? How do I get this new technology to come and work in my little company? I'm already overwhelmed by just keeping the company going. So you have to have, in that case, good public policies that interact and are targeted at the needs in certain areas. We then come up with, each of you have this, so I'm not going to go through each of these, a number of specific suggestions which came out of, again, our discussion with people a lot smarter than we were on these different issues, of what the working groups could talk through and work on as they were going through each of these areas: apprenticeships and related workforce training, credentials, data transparency, and then Industry 4.0. The costs of not acting on these issues are going to be really high. For the individual, it's going to be lower wages, no job offers, job losses. For the employers, you have the possibility of higher vacancies, higher turnover, being less competitive. And for the three countries, the potential costs, in fact, are a lot of social and political disruption and being less competitive economically. So it's much, much more in our interest to try and get this collaboration right, to learn from each other, and the continent can be a lot more effective in global competition if we do that. So let me stop here. I think first I'm going to invite a few other of the colleagues up here to comment. We'll then have a few Q's and A's. We'll get some coffee, and then we'll invite our additional experts and specialists to come up and share some thoughts with us too. But let me invite our two government representatives to give a little bit on what both the government of the United States and Canada are doing in this area to start off with. And if I could invite David Langdon from the Department of Commerce, who's been working on these issues for a long time as chief economist over at the Commerce Department, and has been working on with the interagency group, developing a number of the ideas, and the private sector group. So, David, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation, and congratulations on your report. I'm very interested. I'm looking forward to sitting down and digging into it in more detail. I'd like just to provide a quick overview of the federal government's approach to workforce policy currently, which is actually largely inspired by the report we'll hear about in our second round. So the CFR report, which I actually literally carry around in my backpack, was consulted pretty regularly.
Well, that's nice to hear, Ted. Hey,
Is
all right.
sort of fed into one of two executive orders that the administration laid out that are driving workforce policy. The first executive order from summer of 2 years ago was on apprenticeships, and basically an approach to scale and diversify apprenticeships by creating a new system for recognizing apprenticeship value, referred to as industry recognized apprenticeship programs, or IRAP. I'm sure Bob could talk about it, I'm sure, in great detail. And it's a program that takes an 81-year-old federal registered apprenticeship program system and says basically that this system is fine, but it's very narrow in its scope and not sufficient, I would argue, to support more rapid scaling of apprenticeships and diversification into new industries. And the approach, which is being laid out through a regulatory process, would empower trade associations and unions and other organizations to be recognized as certifiers of apprenticeship quality in the United States. And it's a regulatory process. I can't really say a lot about where it's going to end up, except I think it's supposed to be finalized next spring. But long story short, it has the potential to support growth of apprenticeships from being a very niche program, both in overall numbers and also within companies in the United States, to something that's much more common. The second executive order is actually sort of came out of that first one organically and lays out the need for a national workforce strategy, which actually is being drafted now. This will be a real document that you can store in your backpacks, hopefully by next summer. And it is the executive order basically lays out a couple institutions that are creating this strategy right now. The first one is an interagency council, the National Council for the American Worker. Its members are 14 heads of either federal cabinet agencies or White House offices. Ross, for our Secretary of Commerce, Secretary Scalia from the Labor Department, and Joe Grogan, the head of the Domestic Policy Council. They meet quarterly, and actually our next meeting is tomorrow at the principals level, and are both crafting this strategy and of course already 3 years into this administration implementing a lot of the aspects of it as well. Separately, the administration recognized the need for outside guidance in certain policy areas and established a federal advisory council called the American Workforce Policy Advisory Board, which has met 4 times already. I'm one of the 2 people who basically runs this group. It's a 25-member federal advisory council that includes some basically name brand CEOs who are truly really involved in it. So we have Tim Cook from Apple, Ginny Rometty from IBM, Barbara Humpton from Siemens, multiple others. We have heads of multiple community colleges, labor unions, the governors of Indiana and Iowa, and the mayor of Charlotte. So it's a diverse, basically highly engaged group that we've tasked with looking at 4 different policy areas that are sort of major chapters of our workforce strategy. One, and they're echoed by a lot of the themes in your new report in kind of very interesting ways. One is around promoting multiple pathways and actually developing a campaign for multiple pathways to careers, which would include work-based learning as well as other approaches to acquiring skills and to demonstrating skills that aren't necessarily a 4-year college degree. And as a parent, I'd say, it's a challenge, right? It's a challenge to know what's out there, but there's a need to obviously recognize these kinds of programs. The advisory board actually in September issued specific recommendations for private sector groups to take the lead on this, and 2 of the members of the advisory board in their own capacity are doing so right now. So Apple and IBM have taken the lead with working with a number of other private sector partners and the Ad Council to actually craft a messaging campaign along these lines for launch at the end of January, including a website. The target audiences would be teenagers, so like my older daughter, Sarah, and also mid-career workers, so potentially me, who are thinking about, basically what are their potentials, what are the opportunities for acquiring skills, what programs are available to you, and so it'll be very targeted set of messages, and that's about all I can say about it right now. But we're very excited about this, and this was actually a huge White House priority as well. So there, share the excitement. The second piece is around basically skills-based hiring and in general. It's sort of a theme that is woven through all of our different policy areas, but also the development of policy around basically implementing skills-based hiring practices at the corporate level. The advisory board last week issued a sort of a broad definitional statement of what they want to look at, and are expected to lay out potentially some principles around skills-based hiring. One of the members of the advisory board is Johnny Taylor, the head of Society for Human Resource Management, and something that they've been looking at anyway. The third piece is around data transparency, and data transparency feeds in again into a lot of these, but the idea is that there's a need to create better mechanisms both to compare educational pathways, to the ROI in education, and also to communicate the skills that are needed in the labor market. So among the sort of both workers and learners, employers, and educators. There was a white paper that was developed in September in cooperation actually with Scott Cheney's group, among many others, on something we're calling interoperable learning records. Not a great name, but it's basically the idea of having a sort of a medical record-like document that communicates all the skills that people acquire throughout their academic learning and on the workplace and in any other contexts. And so the white paper sort of outlines what this would be and the multiple policy considerations involved. And actually a lot of pilot efforts that are already taking place at state, with states. And it outlines steps to sort of accelerate this work right now. But also in terms of the data, there's an expansion of the college scorecard, which is going on right now, which is providing, I think, already a program level data for college undergraduate programs where students are receiving federal financial aid. There's a great program from the Census Bureau, part of the Commerce Department, called Post-Secondary Employment Outcomes, which provides even richer data on college outcomes, their earnings and employment flows across the distribution and across time. Very interesting data program. There's some new data that's being developed by the Department of Labor tied to the training providers through the WIOA system as well. The whole idea is basically to help people make informed decisions around what their educational pathways are. One other element, which I didn't see quite as much in here, but it's sort of in there, is elevating the role of employers. It's consistent with the idea of work-based learning. So in work-based learning, really the employers versus the federal government or state governments are seen as key investors in learners and in education. And so the executive order very much elevates the role of employers. Through one mechanism is through a commitment program, which has actually been pretty successful, called the Pledge to America's Workers, through which the federal government has gathered essentially pledges from companies and trade associations around their new 5-year training programs, training commitments. Very, very broad-based in what they are. Commitments so far number, I think, around 374 organizations and around 14.3 million training opportunities. Range from 1 million, I think, from Walmart, down to just a handful from from SMEs, and they're all very, very interesting. What we're looking at now is how to sort of more institutionalize the pledge and how to sort of capture the outcomes from that information, and in a broader sense, really how to capture the investments, to understand the investments that companies are making in their workforce, to actually get data on this, which as basically don't exist. The federal government, just as much as we say that this is important to us, the data we collect, argue, reflect the values that we have, and we don't really collect data on what companies invest in their workers. And we're looking to develop very clear policy recommendations around how to use existing federal surveys to get information on the employer investments, the workers that are receiving these investments, and the outcomes from them. One last piece, which I very much appreciate your framing here, is around this preparing for change. We will very likely start delving into some issues around. I don't like future of work. I like preparing for change. And what I would actually invite an edit to it. I would put 4 in parentheses. I really feel like it's more like preparing change. A lot of the employers are preparing the changes, and we'll be implementing them. They're active participants in this, and as active participants, they can guide us on and what the skills requirements will be over time, what the occupational changes will be over time, and there's not a federal strategy right now around this at all. There's certain organizations, particularly like our Manufacturing USA institutes, which are looking at how certain technologies maybe are driving changes in workforce needs. And I think we may be using the advisory board to start delving into what some of the best practices is, at least among the members of the board. So that's a quick overview.
Thank you, David. That's great. I must say I am very impressed by the breadth of activity that's going on. I was somewhat skeptical at the start, but actually I've been increasingly impressed by the ideas that have come out of the advisory council and what you're working on. And there are some things that we hadn't thought through exactly either in there. So it's really good. And it's a good example of when we get different groups thinking, we come up with different aspects, and then if we can bring that together and learn from each other. And just, we do talk about in the report, up until we went to print, we talked about what each of the 3 governments were doing as far as we knew. So For example, we have a footnote to the last announcement of the advisory board's recommendations, say they just made them, and here's the
Oh,
footnote.
that's right, all
to look
13,
at
that's
them.
right.
And basically, David, as you said at the end, change is hard for everybody. And it's hard for companies. Some of them learn quickly and well, and others don't, and just like all of us as individuals. So all the more reason that we have these kind of collaborative discussions going on. So thanks very much for being here, and thanks for continuing to work on that. And then I'd like to invite Rhonda Soriaden to speak with us. She came down from Ottawa to join us today. She's from the Ministry of Science and Innovation, and she is particularly the Director of Talent and Skills Development Policy. So it's right up our angle. Thank you very much for coming and joining us.
Thanks for having me here. It's been a really interesting discussion, and actually a lot of the characteristics of the approaches you're taking are very similar to what we're dealing with in Canada. We're probably just doing it we're approaching them in different ways, but particularly what stuck out for me was the challenges that SMEs face versus larger firms. The issues with skills matches for new entrants versus the upskilling challenge. You call it framing the future. We call it the future-proofed agile workforce. And then all of this is kind of changing the roles and responsibilities and the distribution of responsibilities across different stakeholders. And so I thought it was very interesting that you talked about like elevating the role of the employer, so the demand side, and we're focusing on that quite a bit. And as well, how do you institutionalize and enlist commitments from the private sector as well as from different stakeholders? So I thought if it's okay, I'll take a step back, and before I get right into the initiatives in Canada, I would talk a little bit about the context in Canada, if that's helpful, and then I'll get into some of the initiatives. And maybe before I start that, I'll kind of talk a little bit about the fact that, yes, I'm the Director of Talent and Skills located in what is similar to your Department of Commerce, so innovation, science, and economic development. And we work alongside and we try to complement the role that our labor department would play in employment. And the perspective that starts to bring more and more is, well, we've focused over many, many years on skills issues. This is not new. On the supply side, we're increasingly trying to approach the demand side and understand more and more the employer role and the impact on employer. And how do you develop more and more the value proposition and the ROI for employers, given the fact that they have a huge role in steering and nudging the workforce, but as well are challenged with the resources constraints that they have. So I would say in Canada, no differently than in Mexico and the US, we would see our prosperity depending very heavily on the future of Canadians, and particularly the skills and training and experiences that they have in developing the skills of the future. We see a highly skilled workforce as being a key driver of unlocking potential in key industrial sectors. So I thought it was interesting the report raised automotive, aerospace, ICT, all very similar types of sectors. The workforce in Canada is highly recognized for being well educated. We do extremely well on K-12 tertiary education performance, and yet we're still facing very particular labor challenges that are not unique to OECD countries. And underlying those labor challenges for us are three elements. There are shortages in labor supply. There are shortages in skills because of the sophistication and skill sets that are changing, both the need to have technical skills combined with what we call human and foundational skills, and there's a lot of work in how do we kind of improve the foundational skills even at the K-12 level. So in Canada, while we're fortunate to have the provinces and territories and the cities that are heavily involved in learning and development, there's still an element at the federal level of how do we kind of ensure that the innovation skills are there for the future. And so, and then the third element is the issues that we're hearing more and more from employers about the alignment between the skills that are being developed and produced at the post-secondary education, the PSEs, and those skills needs that industry is facing. And because of these labor challenges taking place at the same time as global changes and technological changes and climate change and evolving social values, it's putting an increased pressure on what for us is a large constituent of SMEs, who about 99% of our companies in Canada are small, medium-sized enterprises, so less than 500 employees, and about 90% of the workforce works for them. So the workforce's ability to access training and development is very much sort of affected by the resources and the abilities of the SMEs. So technology change being a massive issue for everybody is also then compounded with the fact that we've got an aging population. So that's no surprise, I think, for anybody. And yet at the same time, how do you increase participation? So there's a lot of effort right now in trying to look at how do we ensure that there's no members of society not participating fully in society, and as well as taking advantage of opening access to talent. So a lot of focus on the domestic talent base, so ensuring that new entrants can easily access and enter the labor market, but as well that we are continuing looking at our immigration policies and open immigration policies to bring in global talent as well. And we are, we've seen the investments of, countries in training and development. I mean, in Canada, we're sort of, as you look at your diagnosis of where you stand and where can we kind of look at some of our shortcomings, investments in training and development have been falling. And they, and this is an important area, not just for industry to take a look at, but government to take a look at. And so we're looking at a number of initiatives where we're seeing emerging solutions sort of coming up across industry, where industry is trying to fill in, the spaces where the post-secondary education institutes are still trying to evolve into. But they're happening in fragmented ways across the country, and we're trying to look at how do we examine these, evaluate these, and then scale them up. And so I'll talk a little bit about these initiatives. But before I go into that, I think there's also the growing recognition that we're evolving more and more from a world of education and credentials being once the way that you would prove what it is you have, to a world of defining skills, and there's no yet common lexicon for those skills. And so part of the skills mismatch challenge that we're facing and we're finding is just the language and the terminology that companies and students are using. And so that's why I was very encouraged that the report also talks a great deal about data and evidence. And I was encouraged by the fact that at least we're using the same numbers. 41% of Canadian firms are saying they cannot find the talent they need. And a large percentage of those firms are saying then they're resorting to having to use just a body. And so how does that affect productivity and growth? And that's an important element for us as well. I've taken a few notes here, so if you don't mind, I'm just checking back on my notes, because I do want to spend a little bit of time talking a little bit about then where are we at with our programming and some of the recent introductions that we've made in past federal budgets, and still what we're trying to look at as we frame the future and future initiatives. So, I mean, in government, like I said, in Canada, the skills challenge is not new. But I'd say the discussion over the last 3 years has particularly started to ramp up with increased participation of industry involved. About 2 years ago, we had a number of CEOs brought around the table to discuss in 6 key industrial sectors their challenges. And their number one challenge to innovation and growth was finding the right people with the right skills at the right time. So I don't think that's a big surprise. And some of the conversations that they had and solutions that they identified were no different than what we are seeing emerging as best practices across OECD, across other countries. And there are 4 elements in particular that we seem to all be talking about. And that is, in Canada, we had once invested in sector councils, and so we still have the legacy of those sector councils existing, and that's a good opportunity where companies are coming together through the associations and talking about similar skills challenges and opportunities that they're facing in their industries. But they're talking about how do we increase this dialogue and continue this dialogue of stakeholders coming together, particularly in order to be able to help influence and advance curriculum that's being developed by the post-secondary education institutes, and as well as the K-12 level. There's a number of emerging technology areas that we're seeing that if we don't actually start 10 years, the K-12 years, that we actually won't have the talent pipelines desired for the companies. So we have a number of programs like CanCode, for example, that tries to complement existing provincial curriculum with additional foundational skills in digital and coding. And then we have other programs like Let's Talk Science that also helps to promote STEM for younger students, and understand then the promotion, the career pathways that come from that. So in government, we just recently did a horizontal review of our skills programming, and we looked at a subset of the key ones, that we thought were relevant to developing and supporting skills development, in order to be able to kind of understand where are the gaps in our current programming, and then where else do we need to go, given that it's such a pressing need for industry and for the Canadian growth. We have about $7.5 billion in skills programming. Now, I know relatively to our economy, that's actually, you know, a sizable share, and about 100 programs. And what we found across those programs were there's some interesting opportunities where we can have more employer-oriented programs, so more programs on the demand side, elevating the role of the employer, but also in upskilling in particular. So our recent budget announced a tax-free Canada training benefit to be able to support adult education and return to education. And we have also other initiatives like skills boost initiatives that are oriented to mature learners. But I think there's still an ongoing opportunity for us to talk a lot more about the experiential learning component to upskilling and for mature workers and ways to do that. And I know, having, you know, read and seen the OECD reports, I think the what is very clear across all the countries, then it becomes like the how. How do you start to incent employers? How do you, you know, make the connections with the PSEs? And so this is where getting down to the technical, fine collaboration opportunities becomes really important. We have a number of bodies where we engage with industry on a regular basis across the key sectors. Now it's kind of looking at how do we take advantage of these bodies to advance the skills conversations so that they're not happening in fragmented ways in local regions, and we're able to scale up best practices across these regions. So at ISAD, working closely with our labor department, we take our skills, we try to ensure that our skills programming are you know, covering the spectrum of the innovation continuum. So right from the beginning, entrepreneurship, job-ready students, R&D, you know, HQPs, also supporting skills in growing areas like tourism as well. And so I'll give you a flavor of some of the different programs that we do have, and we can get into these in more detail if you'd like, but I'd say if you start at the K-12 level, where we're trying to kind of promote and complement the curriculum, I mentioned this Can Code program that we have, which is supporting K-12 students to have exposure more to developing digital skills and coding skills. We have Let's Talk Science and Promo Science, which kind of exposes young students to careers and experiences in the STEM. So going through the experiences of hackathons, and we're increasingly hearing about what this means for students to have, you know, like your daughter, Sarah, you mentioned? Okay. And I have two young kids too as well, like, you know, Nabil, my 10-year-old son, who, you know, is trying to understand what does it mean to take advantage of, you know, data from NASA and then kind of explore social community issues so that they have a chance to see what it's like to work on real life problems. And then we recently introduced additional funds into work-integrated learning. So there's a number of components to how we are working on experiential learning for new students. We've got about $1 billion invested into WIL for new students. We have our student work placement program, which offers a wage subsidies program to particularly SMEs who normally wouldn't be able to kind of take on some of the risk of bringing in a student and onboarding. It's to incent them, encourage them. We have another program called MyTax, which sort of allows for students to explore the applied research world, but again, from an industrial perspective and working with an industry. And then we have a very important component of our work-integrated learning, which is funding for our Business Higher Education Roundtable. And what that is it's a PSC, private sector roundtable that comes together and discusses both the front-end ways and the back-end ways of influencing curriculum and having greater alignment between the supply side of talent pipeline being developed as well as the employer needs. And so there's a lot of conversations at that table about how do you enlist companies, how do you get over the hurdles of why companies are not bringing in new entrants, how do you convince students that there's more than 5 companies in the world to work for and the opportunities that introduces. So a lot of very soft, practical issues that are creating barriers to the talent pipeline, matching the employer needs, that, you know, there's an opportunity for government and leaders to kind of work together to kind of dispel some of the myths as well, particularly in manufacturing, that we're trying to deal with. So career promotion and these sectoral campaigns are something that's actually increasingly we're realizing can have a big bang as we approach them. And then, in the HQP areas, we recently invested additional funds to have an additional 500 master's students and about 200 more PhD students. Again, like I mentioned, we're third in the OECD for our educated population. So right now, there's a lot of focus on how do you make sure that these students are able to transition into the labor market. And we understand more and more that it's not just about the technical skills that they have to have, but really that situational experience that the students are having. And so that's our whole approach. That's where I think we spend quite a bit of time on the apprenticeship programs, and there's still opportunities for us to improve that. But there's been a lot of discussions in Canada about the 8 different forms of experiential learning, and how do we offer opportunities in all of those different opportunities. So recently we announced about $150 million in kind of low-cost quick ways, applied projects, hackathons, different kind of opportunities for students to kind of connect into the industry and see what it feels like. And then into the upskilling area, I think this is still an opportunity for us to have ongoing conversation. Not an easy one to approach, but we recently announced funding for the Canada Training Benefit. And I think there's an opportunity in how do you kind of ensure that adults and mature workers are being leveraged for the skills and capabilities that they have. And we take advantage of moving workers from transition sectors, because we don't fully understand the impact of automation, but we know there's going to be an impact. But then there's also an opportunity then to be able to transition those employees into high demand industries. So there's an interesting emerging pilot project called Palette, where this organization has kind of identified a pool of labor that is working in sales in the retail industry. Has huge potential if they're kind of upskilled, reskilled in terms of understanding the ICT world, so that they can be applied to sales in the ICT industry. And then it brings together the industry consortiums, like firms, to help with the training curriculum, develop that training curriculum within a 6-week period of time. So it's a lot more practical for adults to actually go and take on those courses, because I think that's a huge barrier too to that upskilling component, is the amount of time that it takes of an adult's life to go back and get upskilled and reskilled, and then bring in interested hiring partners to onboard then these individuals. So, this is a good example of some of the interesting pilot sort of emerging initiatives that are coming out, and it's how do we look at partnering with industry to be able to scale these up so that they can span across and have impact across Canada. I hope I'm not taking up too much time, but I will come to a close with probably 2 more short programs. On accessing global talent, we had a global talent stream program where we recently made this permanent. And so basically it's an expedited process for bringing in foreign talent. And we've heard positive comments about that, and there's an appetite to continue with that. And recognizing then the credentials that come along with that. And there's a lot of work being taken to kind of try to recognize in key occupations the credentials of foreign talent within a year, because of how long it can take. And then the final one that I'll kind of touch on is the future skills. So how do we ensure that we have an agile, future-proofed workforce? And so we recently announced funding for a Future Skills Center, which is essentially looking at funding projects that are testing out innovative approaches to dealing with some of the skills challenges of the future. This center takes in projects, pilot projects, research projects, funds them, and then now the opportunity is how do we kind of assess and understand what are the skills demands, because one of the things that we hear about is how do we have a common narrative on what the emerging technologies are going to lead to and what the skill sets will be required for those. And so attached to the Future Skills Center then is also a Future Skills Council, which sort of engages with industry, discusses among one another with PSEs, with the private sector, as well as with government, what will be the future skills demands, and try to articulate and put some common narrative to that. So I'll pause there, and then happy to kind of continue with the conversation.
Thank you, Rhonda. Clearly, a lot of very interesting projects and creativity going on in helping stay up with our creative economies. If I can ask, Robert Lerman was one of the champions of apprenticeship before apprenticeship were in fashion, and he's stayed champion.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks to Tony and the Wilson Center. I mean, just learning a bit about Canada, it's illustrative of how we need to learn from each other, especially in the U.S. context where we've really not had a kind of human capital department. We have an education department, but they're more concerned with education credentials and test scores. We have a labor department, but they have a whole variety of tasks focused on the hard to serve and second chance programs, unemployment insurance, EEO, pensions, a whole range of topics that are not directly linked to the overall human capital development of the country. In terms of the report, I was struck by, happily struck by the absence of saying, well, it's all in the education system. If we just get that right, everything else will come out okay. Over the years, when we've had tried to have conferences on apprenticeship, and there'd be a few people, maybe even a couple of hundred people there, I would remind people that we were dwarfed by even the company-based sponsorship of education reform and all of the investment in education. And I would say that in terms of the U.S. investment in training, that very low number is partly associated with what we call training. But if you include the amount that community and technical colleges spend on occupation-related coursework, the number is much higher. Now it isn't as all that successful, but that's why we have all these commissions on the workforce and so on. That if everything was solved, we wouldn't have to do that. Before I get, I'm going to say something about apprenticeship, but before I get there, you talked about data, and also David talked about trying to measure what employer training is. But in my view, we ought to have some sort of advisory opinion on employers reporting to their own shareholders or to the public what it is that they spend and do on training and upgrading their workforce. That is to say that if you have two companies that show the same measured bottom line, but one spends a lot on training and it's all expense, which is good for tax purposes, and the other doesn't, the company that spends a lot on training has probably a better future, just as the company that spent more on research and more on investment in general. So what you have with companies is they have a lot of discussion on what their physical capital investment plan is going to be, but they don't have anywhere near the same attention. Maybe it shouldn't be quite the same, but there should be something on what is our human capital investment strategy, how do we report it, how do we persuade people who might want to invest in our company that we're doing a good job with that. And I think there is now an ISO standard for human capital reporting. There's a greater interest in this, and the head of ADECO is a big champion of this, I know, from a meeting at the Swiss embassy. Excuse me. Now, when we turn to, there's a whole lot of things mentioned, many of them I like, but I'm going to focus a bit more on apprenticeship. And I'm glad the report highlighted that as its number one recommendation, apprenticeship and other forms of work-based learning. So I don't really have to talk too much about the why to do it. We all know that when people utilize what they learn in classes, they do better, they're more engaged. I think we often forget the importance of student engagement in the learning process. There are scores, the amount of learning opportunities that are available relative to when I was growing up is amazing. But, you have to engage, you have to have some basic skills to engage, but engagement is a very critical point. If we just turn a little bit beyond our continent for a second, for one moment. I'm going to give you a number which to me sort of knocks me out a little bit, which is that 95% of Swiss 25-year-olds have either a completed apprenticeship or a BA level degree. They have a lower BA rate than the United States, so a great share of that is an apprenticeship. And they have a higher per capita income than the United States. Now, this is 95%. Now, I often say that in the United States, you can always find something that is at world scale, the best, best practice throughout the world. The problem is it's a smaller segment than many other countries. So let me turn, I know I was supposed to take just a few minutes, and I'll try to keep it at that. Turn to the question, so Bob, if apprenticeship is such a great thing, and I think you're convinced that it is, we've answered the why do it, but we have to get to the how to do it. And in my view, some of the recommendations are fit very well in terms of skill frameworks. What do we mean by skills in different occupations? If you look at the Institute for Apprenticeship in England or the other Australia's skill development standards, not to mention Switzerland, Germany, Austria, and so on, what you find is that companies don't have to spend a lot of time defining it. They might adjust what the skill frameworks have been laid out are, but they have a good starting point. And when they see that starting point, it used to be there was a joke where people, not that funny, but anyway, you'd ask companies, well, what do you want? Well, we just want somebody to show up on time and to be able to work with other people and not get into too much trouble. But then, and so some people took that a little too literally, because if you then went and asked them, well, what else would you want them to do? They have a whole list of other things. Well, we want to have them some experience, we want to have some occupational skills, and so on. So these skill frameworks provide not only, and we at Urban Institute have been doing that, you can look at our website, and we have for about 30 occupations a range of skill frameworks. We do emphasize employability skills as well as occupational skills and competencies. And we start from the question of what do you want people to be able to do? What are the functions in that field that you want people to do very well? Not just be able to do, but do very well. And then what competencies do you need to be able to achieve those? So it's competency-based, which can move more quickly than some of the traditional apprenticeships. So we need high-quality skill frameworks. They have to be able to adapt, of course, not every year, but over time. I think a second thing is just even, and I was delighted to hear David talk a little bit about this, is sort of the branding and making it a real brand that people are aware of, that it's a very high-quality route to a rewarding career, and this is a way of doing that. I'm not sure it's as important as some of the other things, because I think once we get to some degree of scale in some communities, people who go through the program will tell their friends, their brothers, their sisters, hey, this is a good way to learn. And as I have mentioned many times, I think apprenticeship is fundamentally about learning by doing, and widening the way we teach. But the final thing that I'll mention, and I'm sorry if I went over, is the issue of how do you get companies to adopt apprenticeships. And in the United States, I can't speak for Canada or Mexico, But in the United States, we need a cadre of people who can sell companies on apprenticeship and help them organize the apprenticeship. Most company officials, in the human resource area, they've been doing things the same way for a long time. They're a little bit reluctant to change, to avoid using a BA as an entry requirement and so on. So, and the company leaders, they're doing a bunch of things. They're trying to find customers, they're dealing with government regulations, they're dealing with suppliers. They're doing a whole bunch of things, and they say, well, we can't find workers, but they haven't really devoted the same energy that they have, and maybe it makes sense. But what I have seen examples, both in England and in South Carolina in the U.S., and even in our own work, we're now trying to do this as well, where companies just don't understand what apprenticeships are, how to do it well. And if you can help them do that and show them, hey, it's not that complicated. You're already doing some training. Let's make it more rigorous. Let's make it something that we can link to, future learning as well. Make your company into more of a learning organization. And even the people in the organization who are not doing the apprenticeship will see, hey, these new people are learning a lot. I want to learn this stuff. So making companies aware of that and how to do it, not just being aware of it, but how to do it, is a really critical step. You cannot expect companies to simply say, well, we're talking about this in Washington or in Ottawa and so on. And, they aren't reading the paper. They're not reading these white papers. They're trying to get their business going. They're trying to compete with the other companies. And so you need to make it simple for them. And I think if we do that, we can begin to scale apprenticeship and reach a tipping point where companies say to other companies, hey, this is a good idea. I've tried this and it works.
Thank you very much, Bob. So now we can go here quickly, a company perspective from a rather large employer in, I think, all three parts of this continental economy, and which has also gotten the message, been trying to work on this. So Welby, please share a little bit of what you're doing in Walmart.
Great. Well, first, thanks a lot for this great report, and also for the way that you and Mexico Institute really allowed companies to be part of the process by giving ideas up front, and then also working it into the recommendations, because we do appreciate the idea of sharing a best practice with a real respect for the private sector as an initiator of best practices in important ways. Also, the work-based learning and credentials recommendations are really critical to us. This is also a laudable report for a different reason, because it's hard. We know it's hard in the U.S. A bunch of us have been working on that in multiple contexts, but this is a North American report. And that's actually much more complicated for two reasons. One, the level of adoption of technology and the relative costs of capital and labor in Mexico is vastly different than in Canada and the United States. So the sharing trilaterally of best practices needs to take into account that there is a huge difference in some of the underlying facts at this point. That's very promising, because it allows sharing across the whole development curve in some sense with regards to those issues, and might avoid some of the pain in Mexico that's been felt in other places. And Mexico has insights for geographies in the United States. The second part of the reason why it being a North American report is so important and complicating is because look at the jobs that we do recognize as being essentially North American. There's sort of two sets. One set is under tremendous political and policy-based pressure right now because of changes with regards to trade and immigration. So migrant work and trade jobs that are directly or indirectly supported by trade, tremendous pressure on those jobs. And then a second set of jobs that we recognize as being truly North American, which are for the most well-educated among us, which is, as a general matter, not the problem that gives rise to the opportunity and challenge of the future of work. So we need to recognize that fact that North America in this report is complicating. It's not the same as just looking at the US, Mexico, and Canada. But because we do view the future of the economy as North American, essentially North American, that complication must be addressed and well. So let me, if I could, be unfair in asking of you guys help in looking at, with me right now, a draft of something that we're thinking about for North America, and asking of you feedback that'll be much better than what you hear from me. It's a diamond. The way I this is truly internal, so please, this is all off the record from my perspective, to say I like calling it the Ace of Diamonds. The Ace of Diamonds because these are the 4 points set up as a diamond diagram that we need to ace in order for the future of work in North America to be positive. So if you're keeping notes, you can literally draw a diamond because I'm about to fill in 4 corners. The top one is a commitment by business to being person-centered and tech-enabled instead of tech-centered. If there's always the division of people, the optimists and the pessimists with regards to the future of work, and they often divide based upon how they think technology develops. That is not what will determine whether we should be optimistic or pessimistic. What will determine it is commitment. And having a private sector commitment to being person-centered and tech-enabled and working it into your business planning, so that you are aware at every point along the business planning process. You're looking at new technologies. Okay, now we're going to adopt this technology, and we're going to adopt it in a way consistent with who we are. We are person-centered, tech-enabled, not tech-centered. If we have that commitment, we think that that's the beginning of acing this diamond. In that regard, then, I'd encourage everybody, and it's very consistent with what Mr. Lehrman and others have identified, I would look at the shifting definition of the purpose of a corporation as defined by Business Roundtable, which our CEO, Doug McMillan, the CEO of Walmart, is about to chair, and which we'll be working a lot on in supporting him in the Business Roundtable. Being person-centered and tech-enabled means that you are recognizing part of the purpose of the corporation as your people and people outside of the corporation. So then let me take this person-centered and tech-enabled idea and divide it into the next 2 corners of the diamond. So we can turn first to the person-centered aspect of it. So what does person-centered mean in the North American context? Well, one thing that it means is that we can't fetishize STEM. He's reminding me that we're webcasting, so which is okay because actually one of the skills that we're learning in Walmart is you can't engage in the digital context without being willing to go out with drafts because things are changing so quickly and you need the inputs. So I I say that to everybody who is listening. I am sharing a draft. And we're sharing a draft because we're in this together and we need inputs and we need feedback. So the person-centered idea, we can't fetishize STEM for one reason, that it's up to the person. If you're person-centered, you need to take into account that some people don't want to do STEM, and others aren't there yet, or they were already there. So think of the true entry-level folks, right, who still need to learn customer service, and they need to learn basic digital skills and so forth. But not everyone is going to or wants to or can study STEM. And so we need to identify we need to recognize the social value of business being able to generate work opportunity at all points along the skill curve, using a whole series of skills, some of which are STEM related and others of which are not, but most of which have a digital component to it in the future. The credentials aspect of this report is really important to us. The micro-credential idea in particular, because we do see that if you are recognizing as policymakers, and we do want policy makers to recognize, and as employers, the value of work opportunity at all points along the skill curve, then you are going to want micro-credentials that can help people over the course of their career build up that skill curve. The credentials that Walmart is developing and has been developing seek to do that, starting at the true entry level. So we have career pathways that we worked on with people in this room, both at the sort of entry-level managerial level and then at the true entry level. So I'll mention the entry-level managerial level. With regards to that sort of credentialing and training, first of all, the scale that Walmart's brought to it over the last 4 years is really striking. Every time I speak about this, I need to check in on the number because it goes up so much more quickly than I'm anticipating. So, for a period of time, I was still talking about it being 250,000 people when it had already gone to 350, and now we're at 500,000 and well beyond. So the credentialing that people receive within Walmart is meant not just to develop a progression of skills in a career within the company, but also out of the company. Because, again, to be person-centered means that you take people for what they are and want to be. And some people want a career within a company, and others are within one company for a time and want to move on to something else. So in that regard, it's very important to identify credentials that are portable into new visions of one's career. And for that reason, things like customer service are critically important because it's important to you as an entry-level worker at Walmart. It also happens to be probably the number one thing that correlates with success as an investment banker if you get the right education, or many other types of jobs like that. So in that context, I want to mention a Mexico-specific problem, which is the sort of signature program for training in Mexico under the current government is an excellent and laudable idea, which is to get a set of workers, what in Spanish they often call ninis, those that neither have a job nor are in an education program at the time, and who often come from socioeconomic backgrounds in which they don't have connections to leading employers, into training programs and work programs within programs with a stipend paid by the government. It's called Young People Building the Future, Jóvenes Construyendo el Futuro. And the idea is great. One of the difficulties is there is a lack of understanding about the value of entry-level skills. So we have seen a tremendous drop-off in interest by participants in this program because they don't see the types of jobs that we can train for in retail as relevant to their futures. So as a result, we really need to double down on this idea of building out this social value of work opportunity at all points along the skill curve. If you give everyone the continual message that the only thing that matters is STEM, they lose out on entry-level jobs that can build this career and educational opportunity over the longer term. The switching, I have more there, but I need to self-edit. So I'm going to switch over to the other side of the diamond, not at the bottom, but on the other, across from it. Bringing the tech-enabled idea from person-centered tech-enabled. The idea of being tech-enabled really does come down to sort of a set of ways in which tech-enabled training works. So I'll just list them off. What we're seeking to do in our training programs, we're trying to use tech to train better. So we're trying to train with regards to the use of technology and the employment of digital skills. We're trying to train trainers who can then in our entire ecosystem push out these digital and tech-enabled skills. And then I'll get to one other idea at the end of this section. So using technology to train better means that in our on-the-job training, we have VR and many other. Honestly, a lot of the people who come to our training programs within Walmart, and again, like we're talking 500,000, well over 500,000 in the last few years, just in the U.S., have not developed the skill of using an iPad. An iPad now becomes a remote for the typical retail employee working in a digitally enabled store. So just bringing iPads into the classroom, and for that matter, using VR so that they can anticipate what it will be like outside of this classroom, which is co-located with a store, but still you're going back and forth a lot. In the classroom, they're often seeing, thanks to VR, how they could apply things so that when they get into the store, they're able to do it more naturally. So technology, to be tech-enabled, does mean you need to bring technology in to help improve training. Secondly, you need to train with regards to technology and with regards to digital skills. I'll skip over that because I sort of discussed it a little bit in the person-centered idea. The training the trainers idea is important too, in that, and it's related to the last point I want to make, that the relevant nature of the employer is not just its employer status, but also its other stakeholder relations. So in Walmart's context, we have more employees than any other private sector company, but we also have more customers. And those customers, in like manner, have a future work challenge. And so as we digitally enable the store and digitally enable our employees, we are creating a huge set of people who can work with our customer base to get them into the digital economy by helping them, for example, in Mexico, load for the first time a Cashi app and understand how to use it so that they can start using digital stored value and use it as a way of getting onto the digital economy even though they're unbanked. Things along those lines are very important leverage points. And so employers and, for that matter, policymakers that look at them need to recognize the all of the different elements of an employer's nature, so that they're working on the sourcing relationships, the customer relationships, and the employee relationships. So in some ways that that then is quite related to this idea that that in Walmart's case, that relationship with customers also includes, well, what do we sell and how do we sell it? It's not just the process of buying something, which means that customers will start engaging with technology, and our employees, having been trained well, will teach them how to do so. It's also about, can we in fact sell certain things that address some of the core challenges of the future of work? So will retailers have a role in selling AI solutions that address some of the lower skill and challenges? In the same way that artificial limbs are most valuable to those who do not have limbs, can we use artificial intelligence to provide intelligence solutions to those who have specific challenges in the future of work? Why is this a diamond? It's a diamond because we think that in the North American context, all of that leads to an important area that's often not given much emphasis in the future of work, which is economic formalization. This is because on both sides of that diamond, you recognize that if in fact you're going to be person-centered, building out work opportunity and work opportunity and career opportunity at all points along the skill curve, you're going to need a continual source of people who can be brought into formal careers. And so economic formalization, especially in an economy like Mexico, is really important. And you need to recognize the special challenges of informality as you're working on being tech-enabled, because we need to recognize that a huge chunk of the economy is just not in the part of the economy that does things like tech-enabled training. And so what are we going to do about that? So just a couple ideas in that regard. One, Walmart Foundation gave a very large grant to the Mexico Institute over the last 2 years, and felt very good about the recent report out of results. It's a very valuable report that I think is worth everyone looking at, that looks, it's not specific to future of work, but it looks at the nature of ag sector employment between Mexico and the United States, including migrant workers, and their own understanding about what makes for motivation to move, to stay in this sort of employment. So it looks at things like legal compliance and so forth, and also opportunity. That understanding that sector is really important, because we're going to need to have strong labor compliance in that space in order for there to be real opportunity for a huge set of people that live in and out of informality. Secondly, the general role of business of formal business in pushing out the envelope of formality across the employee or employer sourcing and core customer axes. It has a huge impact on the future of work, because you are bringing into the formal economy a set of SMEs that are sourcing to you, and also a set of employees that have thus far not had careers because they've been in the subsistence informality sector. So for that reason, processes within business and policies within the public sector that advance formalization and that respect the private sector's role in formalizing the economy are really important. And then I would give an example there from Mexico and from Guatemala. There are ways in which we recognize that rule of law and poor rule of law, let's say in the south of Mexico and in the north of Central America, is a huge challenge for the future of work. and for informality. That it's not circular. Informality is it obviously includes a rule of law weakness, but you need to work on rule of law as a policymaker in a way that will bring that will increase the chances of formalization in a way that doesn't dissipate the interest of large businesses in incorporating newly formalized workers and newly formalized SMEs and other suppliers into their supply chains. One way of doing that is by having a sort of trusted operator status for businesses that have high compliance standards, so that they can work with small businesses and newly formalized employees that will invariably still be learning the life of formality. Unless there's some degree of sort of protections in the same and sort of benefit of the doubt in the same way that one experiences in the trade context with trusted trader programs, businesses are scared of doing work with newly formalized SMEs because their own tendency to fall back into non-compliance causes legal risk for the company. As a result, you don't get this sort of escalator effect of bringing people into formality and then incorporating them into career opportunities. 30 more seconds to say, if you look at that diamond, what you see is AMLO's top policy goals. Arguably, obviously he speaks for himself very well, but I take it to be three things that he's especially focused on right now. One of which is economic inclusion for two reasons, both for respect and for dignity and for security. Economic inclusion it has been inadequate in many geographies in North America, and it has hurt both respect and has hurt security. That's I take that to be his top goal. Anti-corruption and then formalization of the tax base in order to have the resources and the rule of law and stability necessary in order to accomplish the goals of the state. So in that context, one more idea about the future of work, which is that it's not just about private sector employment, it's also about public sector employment. Right. And there needs to be a sharing across the sectors with regards to what the future of public sector jobs look like as well. If this diamond is correct, and we don't have I'm just describing what the challenges are more than what the answers are here, but if that diamond's correct, and those are the four big things, we can see already that the public sector is going to have to change substantially in how it does some things. For example, Walmart has a huge formalization role, but it can't really play it in a way that will expand out into the geographies in Mexico that aren't covered adequately with economic opportunities, so that we can pull people who currently have only subsistence opportunities into formal careers. We can't do it unless we can build stores in those geographies. And we can't build stores in those geographies unless we can get permits. So how do we get permits? Well, learning these same future of work ideas. How about a micro-credential in exactly the types of digital skills that we're teaching in the private sector to our employees in stores that will help the many lower skilled public sector municipal workers who do licensing and permitting in an average of 14 government agencies in every municipality in Mexico. How about giving them a micro-credential in digital transparency and digital skills so that they can actually run a best in practice single window for licensing and permitting that defeats corruption and speeds permitting, so that we can get out into the geographies in Mexico, pull people into the formal economy, and give them careers across the whole skill curve.
Thank you, Welby. So I'm going to suggest right now we take 2 minutes for people to go to the bathroom or get a drink, and then but what I want to say is clearly we had too many great, wonderful experts here. Ted Alden, as David said, co-chaired the writing of this and wrote a lot of this really formative report on workforce development in the United States, as well as at least two other great books that I really admire on economic competitiveness for the United States. Katie Brown represents a group, the NSC, that has worked really hard on identifying in various states best practices for workforce development, and actually has put some discipline on them and highlighted best performers and highlighted non-best performers. Scott Cheney is leading a tremendous amount of innovation in the whole credentials regime, trying to make that much more transparent and portable. So if we could take 2 minutes, go to the bathroom, get a drink, come back, we'll hear from each of them, and then we'll, for those of you who can stay, we'll have some more, we'll have some discussion and Q&A. Thank you.
Hi. Sure, absolutely. Thank you.
Very interesting.
I read it carefully when I was working on these things. So, yeah.
I carry everything that NSC does around in my backpack.
Yeah, no, it's
I was gonna say
really
I
good
want
stuff.
someone to carry my thing in the backpack. I gotta work on that.
Yeah, well, I'm actually carrying an Aspen Institute report in my backpack right now and a Brookings Institution report. So we all carry each other's reports.
Your name tag is.
Okay. Welcome back. To further exploration of workforce development and all the things that come along with it, including the prosperity of our economy, the well-being of our society, and a few other dozen secondary and tertiary effects. So let me invite Ted Alden first to share a few thoughts, since he's done a tremendous amount of thinking and writing, excellent writing, on these topics over the past several years. Ted, please.
Great. Thanks very much, Tony, and thanks to David for the kind words about our Council on Foreign Relations report. It was just for the record, was co-chaired by Penny Pritzker, the former Commerce Secretary, and John Engler, former Governor of Michigan. So we had great leadership on that report. I'm going to keep this very brief because I know we're a little time challenged right now. I have been doing a lot of work over the last year actually on trade policies of one sort or another, so the timing here with the USMCA finally coming together is very propitious. I think if you look at what's happening in trade policy and globalization, we are clearly, for better or worse, moving into a world of global trading blocs in which regional economies, in the Western Hemisphere, in Europe, in Asia, are going to become much more important than they have been already. And so I think the issue of North American competitiveness, what makes this region an attractive one for companies to invest in, is going to be more important than ever before going forward. And so I think the focus that we've got in the Wilson Center report here on human capital development in North America is exactly where we need to go. I mean, your chart there about what companies are looking at in location decisions certainly fits with all of the conversations we had on the task force. The availability of talent is, for so many companies, really at the top of the list in terms of their location decisions. I just want to mention two pieces that I think are important that Ambassador touched on a little bit in the comments, not so much in this report, and they have to do essentially with mobility and geography in North America. One is the issue of regional inequalities, which is maybe the biggest policy challenge of our time, largely because of the importance of technology and innovation to our modern economy. The spatial distribution of economic opportunity has been changing very dramatically, certainly in the United States, which I know well, but Canada and Mexico and other places too. We're seeing all the growth, all of the good job opportunities, essentially, and that's only a slight exaggeration, taking place in a very small number of highly successful cities. Brookings Institution, Mark Muro and his team at the Metropolitan Policy Program yesterday, along with Rob Atkinson at ITIF, came out with a report saying that basically 90% of new innovation-related jobs are being built in San Francisco and Seattle and San Diego and Boston, and I'm forgetting the fifth, but it's not Washington, D.C. Dallas, thank you. And so what we're not, and the rest of the country, we're seeing a decline in opportunity. And so there's going to need to be a piece of all this that looks at how we can spread opportunity around the country. Some of that's going to be federal support for R&D. Some of the work the Commerce Department's doing with its manufacturing institutes, I think, is incredibly important there. Canadians have a long history with trying to deal with regional inequality questions and trying to promote economic opportunity in places it might otherwise be leaving. I know the Mexico situation less well, but I think that's a conversation we need to be having in North America, not just how to create opportunity, not just how to build the workforce to take advantage of that opportunity, but also how to spread opportunity across our nations. And we all know there are significant political ramifications to this. If you have parts of countries that are prospering and parts of countries that are falling behind, that creates major political challenge, creates a lot of disruption. I mean, you look, again, to use a Canadian example, after the last election, you've got the whole issue of Western alienation back on the table, political divides that have to do with regional economic opportunities. So those are critical, I think, in all three countries. The other piece, and I get why the report didn't touch this, but we're going to have to at some point, is the issue of cross-border labor mobility. I mean, one of the promises of NAFTA was we were going to begin to create something of a North American labor market as well as just a North American trade and investment market. And that piece has continued to shrink, not just because we haven't built on it, but I have done a lot of work on immigration. I spend a lot of time talking with immigration attorneys where I'm living out now in Washington State. I moved there about a year ago. There are a lot of attorneys who work on kind of cross-border labor mobility, Americans who want to go up and work in Vancouver temporarily, people want to come down from Vancouver to Washington State. This administration has been making that process more and more and more difficult. The paper requirements, the requests for evidence, just for a skilled Canadian to come over and work for a few months for a company in Seattle, getting harder and harder. So even within the current system, which isn't very good, we're making it much more difficult. And USMCA, for all of the progress in there, and I think there are some real improvements, didn't touch this issue at all. The whole issue of labor mobility is just so toxic in the political discussion now that we didn't do what obviously needed to be done, which was update the jobs list for North American visas. I mean, that list was put together essentially before the internet existed, so it really doesn't reflect our modern tech economy. And part of the talent challenge is making it easier for people to move to where the job opportunities. There are within-country talent issues like certification, but there are also cross-border issues. And I hope as a region, as we move forward beyond USMCA, as this competitiveness panel comes together, we can start to talk again about some of these cross-border labor mobility issues. So I'll stop there because I know we've got a lot to cover.
Super point, Ted. And just to add for Mexico, of course, one of the big driving forces that brought AMLO to power in Mexico was the regional inequality and the imbalanced development that had happened with NAFTA, and he's trying to adjust that. Scott, you've been looking a lot, of course, at mobility with the credentials, and we have those own border problems in the United States. So please give us some of your perspective.
Sure, thank you, and congratulations again on the report. I too will be carrying it around in my backpack, so you can rest assured that it'll get the same exposure. So very quickly, when I think about what is happening in workforce development, primarily in the United States, but I think elsewhere, and I think this report and the comments from the first panel really highlighted this, I think about what's happening in terms of a need for speed. The economy is changing so quickly, and we're so unsure about what's coming next that we have to figure out the right policies, the right practices in order to support that fast to market, that we can cut down that cycle time to figure out what's needed and how to actually get it into people's hands. We have to be flexible, obviously. We don't know where people are when they start. They might be mid-career, they might be early, they might be a veteran coming out of the service. So we have to be very flexible to understand what they already have, what the need is, how to get it to them in the most efficient manner. And then we need to be focused on fitness, and not the person's fitness, but the fitness to the job requirements. So we have to have really good data, and much better data than we've ever been able to get from employers about what exactly they need. And we talked earlier, I think Bob talked earlier about this default to the BA or to the AA, and even if you try and go beyond that, there are just oftentimes simplistic references to skill sets that you're not really sure what they mean. Leadership and communication skills and other things that could come in any different number of forms. So really getting much better about understanding exactly the right fit that's needed so you can actually be fast to the right fit and in a flexible manner. So I think about then what do we need to do to make that happen? And I think my comments parallel the report to some degree, and it's work that we've been doing for a number of years. So I think about data, policy, and practice. The data elements of this world, I think, have made dramatic leaps inside just the last 5 years, and especially in the United States alone. Data for the longest time had either been so overwhelming that we didn't know where to start, so toxic because you immediately started to touch personally identifiable information. There were all sorts of preclusions put in place in this country to prevent data sharing. And I think those are beginning to fall away a little bit. And I would point to some of the great work that's being done, both in the administration, but also in the T3 network here, that are really working to understand how do you make data more interoperable. At Credential Engine alone, we are developing and have developed two globally accepted open source schema to describe credentials. of all types, from a high school diploma through a PhD, credentials, certificates, certifications, licenses. In the US alone, there are 738,000 unique credentials. We don't have an estimate for the world, but I can take guesses right now around the table. I'm guessing that it's easily over 5 million, probably closer to 10 million plus. In the United States alone, I'm guessing that there are probably 40,000 different providers of credentials. Once you include community colleges, high schools, universities, licensing bodies, Walmart itself, which issues credentials, Microsoft, IBM, Salesforce, all these different entities. And we probably spend somewhere north of $2 trillion in the workforce and education marketplace to help people obtain these kind of credentials. It's a massively confusing and complex economy and marketplace. So what we're trying to do is to make sure that these two schema to describe all credentials and then all competencies are broadly adopted within the United States to make that transparency about what they offer, how they connect to jobs, how they connect to each other, how they connect to military training, is much more transparent and open and easily used. We're actually in conversations right now with a number of other countries. South Africa is very interested in standing up a parallel system to what we're doing here in the United States. And then we could have those two systems be able to talk to each other. So you'd actually be able to get this kind of cross-border understanding about the credentials offered in different locations so that you can maybe ease some of that migration and labor movement once you actually settle on the policies, but at least the data systems are in place. In terms of policy, at least here in the United States, I'm actually a bit of an optimist. I've seen some really good movement happening both within some of the executive orders that David talked about, but also within some of the conversation within Congress about not necessarily just reducing or adding programs, but improving the ability for programs and policies to work together and to share information, to benefit. So you see an example of this in the House-introduced Higher Education Act reauthorization, where in order to access short-term Pell, to use Pell funding for short-term training, certificates and whatnot, they're using a system that's set up in the workforce system called the Eligible Training Provider List. So if a provider is on that list, they are eligible to be able to get Pell money to deliver a short-term training to an individual. That kind of cross-policy collaboration, I think you're going to see more of as some of the new policies come out around reauthorization of WIOA and even some changes that could come down to Perkins, to apprenticeship bills that are coming out. So it's not perfect, but it is a jump in how we've thought about policy as being in individual silos and not being able to work across to help individuals. And then in practice, I think practice is honestly the hardest one, because especially in the United States, where it is so decentralized, you can have great data, you can have great policies, but you still have individual fiefdoms of community colleges and universities and training providers and whatnot who decide, and you can see this in the implementation of first the Workforce Innovation or Investment Act and then the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act, the dramatic differences in how people choose to actually operate those and to put those into practice. And to some degree, you get great innovation out of that, but to some degree, you get great inconsistencies for companies like a Walmart that really are trying to have a national approach to how they can tap into the benefits of policy. So that is going to continue to be at least the largest challenge, and I would imagine the largest challenge across borders as we talk about a three-country North American agenda.
I agree with you. That's why we have to try and bring all those people together, which is complicated in and of itself. Katie, could you say a little bit about the work that you all have been doing and how you see things?
Sure, absolutely. First of all, congratulations. I know I just want to echo everyone on that. I think this is a fantastic report. Briefly, National Skills Coalition is a bipartisan nonprofit, and we're located in DC, but we actually have members across all 50 states. And our members are really focused on the middle skills gap in particular, so jobs that require education and training beyond the high school level, but not necessarily a college degree. And so we work with community and technical college leaders, business leaders, labor organizations, community-based organizations, and basically any stakeholder who really feels strongly about the middle skills gap in particular. And we do a lot of research. We do a lot of lifting up best practices across states, as the ambassador mentioned. And so we have publications, if you're interested in visiting our website, on a number of issues, including apprenticeship and work-based learning, higher education, racial equity in the workforce, and a lot of other things. But I do want to say, before I joined National Skills Coalition, I worked on the Hill as a policy staffer for 2 members of Congress, and this was about 10 years ago. And I remember we really didn't talk much about skills and workforce development. We talked about economic development as it related to the unemployment rate, like how many people had jobs, but we didn't talk about what those jobs looked like, what the pathways for those jobs were, what they would look like in the future. It was pretty one-dimensional. We also talked about the higher education system and the workforce training system very separately. The higher education system was for young people who wanted to go get a 4-year college degree and live on campus. The training programs were for, other individuals, adults who wanted to train and get into the workforce. We didn't really talk about them as having the same goal. And then for the future of work, we maybe mentioned that, but it was very vague. We didn't really talk about what that actually was or concrete policy solutions to get there. And so as a silver lining point, I just want to say we have really changed the narrative around those issues and what workforce development actually means. We actually commissioned polling, the National Skills Coalition, and we looked at likely 2020 voters, small and mid-sized business leaders, and veterans, and polled them on skills policies. Do you care about skills policies? Do you think that the government should care about skills policies? Both broadly polling them and then also specifically on certain policy issues. And all of our policy issues that we posed to them around skills polled above 80%, regardless of which population you were looking at. So we really see not only momentum among policymakers, but also among people and voters and veterans and small business owners. So I think that's a really exciting thing. And then in our future of work initiatives, which we're still building and they're still in process, but I will say we're focusing on 4 buckets. I won't get too deep into them, but we're focusing on how we can help small and mid-sized businesses work with larger businesses across the same industry. We're looking at digital literacy and what digital literacy means, how it's different from industry to industry, and how we can help people get those skills. We're looking at data, which we've talked about is super important in all of this. What data do we have and what data do we need, both at the national level and the state level? And then we're also looking at reskilling and upskilling, as opposed to just looking only at people who are unemployed, how to get them into the workplace. We're going to be looking at people who are already employed but need new skills to stay in their job and be successful. So I think this is a great conversation. I'm really excited about it, and I'm happy to talk after this or answer any questions.
Great, thank you. Okay, let's invite some comments. And please.
I'm a sociologist, and I'm a member of the Board of Governors of the Labor and Employment Relations Association, DC chapter. I've also assessed employment and training programs overseas, particularly in Central Asia. My question to Ted particularly, but everybody else, yes, of course, location is important, but increasingly, if you look at job listings, at least for some jobs, remote is fine. Remote is welcome. Now, that's only a certain stratum, but that gives flexibility. Now, I realize that it's a little hard to do some work in manufacturing remotely, but that's not impossible either. So please speak to that and how that plays into the stress, which is reasonable on location, but there are asterisks there.
Yeah, I mean, this is a great question. I have been a tremendous optimist about the possibility for remote work. And I see some of it where I'm living now. I'm living in a fairly small city called Bellingham, Washington, university there. You see a lot of people from Seattle who manage to remote work and go to Seattle, maybe once a week or something like that and avoid the traffic. The data so far don't seem to bear out my optimism. In fact, what you're seeing is this agglomeration of opportunity, that bringing together smart and creative people of all sorts, having them in the same place, having them work together, seems to matter tremendously. And that's one of the explanations for why we've seen the job growth and the opportunity tend to cluster in these very successful cities. I think it may be starting to shift. I think some of it, and this is anecdotal. If anybody knows studies on this topic, I'd be really interested. But I think part of what starts to happen is you have people who develop careers in these places. They have the network of contacts, and then they're able to move out remotely. And often when they do that, sometimes they're able to bring in other people in that remote location because they need help for the work that they're doing in relation to their employers or their consulting contracts. I think the potential for that is growing. And of course, technology is improving. Remote meetings are still not as good as face-to-face, but Zoom is a heck of a lot better than what we were doing a few years ago in terms of making you actually feel like you're in a room with the people you're meeting. And if you have some prior personal relationships, I think that can work better. So I think that shift is coming. So I'm going to try to hold on to my optimism in that front, because it helps solve a lot of things, right? Because it brings money into these more remote communities, money that's being generated in the big cities. It brings them out into these more remote communities. Also deals with some of just the living problems, the terrible traffic jams and the housing costs and the other real costs for these very successful cities. It's not, you travel in Silicon Valley these days, and a lot of it's kind of a mess, unfortunately, right? It's been too successful for its own good. And so I do think we need to find a way to try to move those opportunities out.
Well, I would just say it really is biased against low-skilled workers. And so since most workers are low-skilled workers in most countries, except maybe Switzerland, that what you mean is for the high-skilled, they can be very mobile. For the low-skilled, they're stuck without jobs or with bad jobs in a lot of cases. We have to be able to overcome that barrier, and then it does depend on sector. Manufacturing is different than services in some ways.
Can I push back just a bit? Because to the extent that you've got higher skilled, well-paid people who are relocating, they're bringing money into those communities, and that's going to create all sorts of spin-off opportunities for locally based services in those communities. So I do think, I'm not disagreeing with your basic premise, but I do think there can be some positive spin-offs for lower skilled workers in those places.
I would just say I think we're learning a lot about what are the drivers to allow that to happen, and an awful lot of it is just the fundamental infrastructure. If you're living in a community where you've got really poor broadband or internet connection, I don't care how talented you are, you're not going to be able to successfully, carry on enough Zoom meetings or do remote whatevers. So it's a combination of skills, it's a combination of industry, it's a combination of technology. But Lord knows we've learned a lot, and I think we're trying to find ways to push that envelope a little bit better. So I'm not sure I see it going to wholesale. I think I see it going to where it's appropriate and where it's successful, it's more possible. And so you'll see that popping up both in communities and industries around the country.
Please.
I just want to get it.
Go ahead. I was just going to say I was being encouraged to add a bit of a Canadian perspective to it, and you probably, a fellow Canadian, can add that too. And I would just say, I guess, for us, well, somebody mentioned that we've got the history on it. I think we have the history of dealing with the challenge. I don't know that we have all the solutions to it. A few ideas come to mind that's relevant to this conversation. We've been investing in superclusters, 6 major superclusters across the country. And there's a lot of discourse around what are our emerging technologies and how do we support that across the country, not just in the key cities where, you start to see AI popping up in Toronto, but it's still in Alberta, it's in Montreal as well. And then how do you kind of leverage the spillover effects, but connect them? So, and then we've got situations where we've got communities heavily dependent on very select large employers. And then we've got regions, I should not say cities, sorry, remote regions and communities where they've lost that key employer. And then now they're trying to kind of invest in a whole new set of strengths that help to attract and grow SMEs. So I think what we're seeing is the importance of at least understanding where the commonalities are, looking at where there are strengths, and but still recognizing there are some, especially in Canada, some regional areas that are poised for real economic growth. but how do we kind of address the barriers so that they can kind of leverage that? There's certainly the element of remote working and the new, the gig economy and how to take advantage of those connections are relevant to it. But whenever we talk about how do we, really try to narrow in on the key sectors where we're going to be able to kind of up Canada's economic situation, there's always the other side of the conversation, which is like, how do we take a look at this regionally and really narrow in on where are we limiting growth and where do we have some really growing emerging areas that if we were to recognize them a little bit better, that they would be able to can strengthen and grow.
Thank you. And for another Canadian
Well,
question.
my perspective is much broader. I have to say I'm very impressed with the effort here of what is trying to put together a workforce development agenda. Extremely ambitious, but the presentations gave a lot of reasons to see advance and progress. I'm impressed also with the remark, there's a cautionary remark of Mr. Alden saying this no longer called a trade agreement, it's now a USMCA agreement. We took out the word trade from it because it's somehow a dangerous term, even that one. I do find that it is, in fact, a tremendously missed opportunity in advancing towards a development agenda towards a workforce. And I find this extremely discouraging because it seems as if the conception and the drive behind this agreement finally was essentially a protectionist inspired effort, because the fear was Mexico was essentially competing unfairly with American and Canadian industry and manufacturing. So I'm trying to get a sense if you believe that given this political environment we're in and this protectionist sentiment remains, it's still there, we can see it, hear it, you see much movement politically to see these progressions towards this workforce development agenda for the future among the three countries that is. Thank you.
I mean, I guess I'll just say quickly on the USMCA. I mean, there's a lot about this administration's trade policy that troubles me greatly, and I think the U.S. pulling out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership was a historic mistake that we will regret for generations. But I will say on USMCA, it's been fascinating. Welby and I and Chris were talking about this before. It's been fascinating to watch the effort to rebuild some political consensus in this country. I mean, the fact the administration was willing to work so closely with Speaker Pelosi, so closely with the labor unions, to try to find a formula that could reestablish some bipartisan consensus on trade here in the United States. We'll see how that goes. But I find that tremendously encouraging. I mean, we are in the same place, unfortunately, on immigration, and the schisms are much deeper and probably harder to overcome. But the fact that we, and I'm really speaking for the United States now because this is our internal problem, have been able to make progress on the trade front, I think is encouraging that we may be able to move on to some of these other issues. So I actually see what's been accomplished here under USMCA. I don't disagree with you on some of the impulses in the U.S. for wanting to renegotiate the agreement. But face it, at the end of the day, if there isn't a political consensus for open trade in the United States, that's a bad thing for Canada, that's a bad thing for Mexico, it's a bad thing for the rest of the world. So I think, your countries just kind of have to put up with us as we try to work our way through this. And this is an encouraging little bit of progress.
And just
Sorry about that.
Just to add,
Sorry about that, yeah, really.
just to add to that, there are certain parts of this agreement that are not trade expanding, but there are other parts that are potentially trade expanding. And that's a lot of the future of the economies, in services, in intellectual property. And the fact that they have put elements in, like this competitiveness committee, that they recognize there's an agenda to get back to make the region more competitive, is hopeful. And the other big plus of this agreement is the certainty. This is an agreement that's going to be around, for over a decade at least. So that allows people to work at making the three economies more competitive together. So I think we just need to press forward.
You looked at me if I wanted to say something, and I wouldn't dare say much about the USMCA, but I will say that. And
Christy was my former boss, so she's a friend if you get in trouble.
No, but I mean, in all honesty, I think to bring it back to the report, you have a very important critical element in the report about data and evidence. And, I didn't mention, but there's data about what's out there, and you talked about how do you bring the programs and better consolidate them. I think, that's an important element for employers to understand what are the solutions that's even out there for them to navigate through. Then there's the evidence on where are we actually at and where do we want to be. And I think that, when the discussion started around USMCA, I was the Director of Automotive Policy and Research in Canada, and I guess working very closely with the automotive industry, what became really interesting was how important it was to put down on paper the evidence about the cross-border connections for the automotive industry. And I think, and some of this data is not always recorded with our statistical bureau, unless you ask the right questions and try to bring it out the right way. And so there was a lot of interesting work done with the industry in terms of understanding how many times is it across the border. And I know there was lots of quotations and references to that. So I guess this whole kind of conversation, to me, the elements I take out is, how do you continue to learn from one another, and, where we're exploring very similar data challenges and the evidence being so important in a policy-driven world, how do we make sure that we're leveraging kind of key learning in terms of what are the indicators that we should be looking at, and how do we leverage the industry indicators, evidence, and metrics in there as well?
Excellent, thank you. One more question? If not, okay, final question.
Hey, just a follow-up for the last question asked about the degree to which the USMCA was brought on by actually kind of protectionist political thinking. To what extent is it in actuality going to be somewhat protectionist? I know it's not directly related to workforce development, but certainly relevant to the labor market within Europe is how protectionist the EU is. To what extent are we perhaps going to see the same thing with the USMCA?
Well, let me start just to say that one of the interesting things about this whole process in the United States is NAFTA and USMCA has become much more popular, and regional trade is much more popular than it ever has been in the United States. You can look at the polling that's been done, and it's just consistently upward. Now, it's changed between Democrats and Republicans during that time. But there's a clear majority of U.S. citizens now, when they're polled, that say, yeah, this is good. It's good that we're trading with our two neighbors. And that was not always the case. So in general public, I think there's a much deeper appreciation of the importance of this trading bloc and how much we build together. And part of it was that people have gotten that data out there, and it doesn't get absorbed the first time or the second time or the third time. But the 10th time, people sort of figure out, yeah, my job really does depend on Canada, or it's the fact that Mexico is buying this stuff. And it's okay that part of what I make goes to Mexico, gets put together and come back because it's cheaper for me. People have gotten that. So that's hopeful. Now, that doesn't mean there are certain parts of this that are not really in the spirit of free trade, but neither is much of the world in the spirit of free trade. So you are still preserving important elements of that. We'll see how this works out in practice. Ted, you want to?
I mean, there has been a real problem here, which is that what you've seen is the diffusion of advanced technologies and capabilities to developing countries, which is a good thing. I'm relying a lot on Richard Baldwin's work in The Great Convergence on this. But what that means is that a Mexican worker armed with U.S. or European technology is almost as productive as an American or a Canadian worker. And what we would expect to see in a genuine kind of freer market arrangement is for those wages to rise. Because of the productivity of Mexican workers rise, their wages would rise. We have not seen that happen under NAFTA. If there's one single big failing under NAFTA, it hasn't had the upward wage pressure in Mexico that we would have expected given the rising productivity. Now, you can say USMCA may be a fairly crude way to try to go after that problem, but I think there's no way for the arrangement to be sustainable unless we are going after that problem seriously. And I think that's good for Americans. At the end of the day, I think it's good for Mexican workers, too. Mexican workers need to be able to share in the growing prosperity of the private sector there. And so I really support a lot of the impulses behind this, even if we can quibble about some of the particulars.
Thank you all very much for coming. Thank you to Rhonda, to Scott, to Ted, to Katie, to David and Bob, who had to leave us, and to all of you for sharing with us. We look forward to working with you. Welby, thank you very much. for all that that you've done in being a good participant and partner for us in this, and for the work of Walmart and other private sector companies. I will add that we do talk about in the report also. So, thanks to everybody. Take care. Have a good holiday season coming up.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.